Good afternoon, and welcome to the concluding panel of this year's America's Role in the World Conference. My name is Alexa Blanton, and I'm a master's student in the International Studies program, and I serve on GS7, the Dean Student Advisory Council. As someone born and raised in Indiana, whose entire family has attended Indiana University for generations, I've been raised with the knowledge that Hoosiers are intelligent, kind, hardworking, and most importantly, we are change makers. During my time at IU, and with the support of the Hamilton Lugar School, I have had the opportunity to travel to 10 countries, learn 2 new languages, and to be a delegate at 2 separate United Nations conferences. Along the way, I have learned how critical it is to combine my identities as both a Hoosier and a global citizen. With that in mind, it humbles me to be able to introduce this panel on Indiana's role in the world. And I cannot think of anyone who understands the ins and outs of the power Indiana has better than Lesley Weidenbener. She has spent 20 years of her career reporting on the Indiana State House, covering 5 governors and over 24 legislative sessions. She currently serves as the managing editor of the Indianapolis Business Journal. Please join me in welcoming Lesley and our panelists.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very happy to be representing the Indianapolis Business Journal. I've been there for about 3.5 years. I was just telling Danny, who's at the State House, that I thought when I left the State House, I thought I would miss it terribly covering politics and going over and covering business, but somehow it just, it turned out to be okay. I don't feel the need to be going over there all the time, but so we have a fantastic panel today, so let me introduce everybody. Right next to me here is Danny Lopez, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff in Governor Eric Holcomb's office and serves as chairman of the governor's workforce cabinet. And if you've been paying attention to Governor Holcomb, you know that is one of his top priorities, so Danny is the guy right now. He's also the former executive director of the Indiana Commission on Hispanic Affairs, and I will note that Danny is also one of IBJ's former 40 under 40s.
Former?
Well, I guess you're a 40 under 40 forever, but it wasn't. I mean, we can pretend it was this year.
I just turned 29, so.
Of course. So next to Danny is Roberto Salinas León, who is president of the Mexico Business Forum. He's director of Atlas Network Center for Latin America and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's an expert on trade, monetary policy, and economic liberalization in Latin America. And he has a number of interesting Indiana connections. I hesitate to say, but he has a degree from the other place, Purdue. But this is not his first time to IU. He's been here to speak before, so welcome. Welcome back. Then we have we have James Lienhoop. He's the mayor of Columbus, Indiana, which is one of the most globally competitive communities in the nation. Lienhoop was elected in 2015 after serving several terms on the Columbus City Council. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you.
And then finally, we have Tiffany Benjamin. She is the Senior Director for Corporate Responsibility and Global Health Programs at Eli Lilly and Company. It's a position she's had, were you just telling me, for about a year?
About a year.
She the way she described her previous roles at Lilly was that she was a lawyer lurking behind the scenes. So we're glad that she's out doing the big time now. So she previously served as Senior Counsel of Oversight and Investigations for the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce. So we're really excited to have you too. Okay. So I want to start our conversation about Indiana in the world by talking about the economy and trade. Exports and direct foreign investments are huge parts of the Indiana economy. So let's start with trade. Indiana is America's 11th biggest exporter. The state shipped $37.8 billion worth of goods around the globe in 2017, and that's a number that's going up. Indiana's exported products represent nearly 13% of the state's GDP. And an analysis by Brookings finds that over half of the economy in Columbus is driven by exports. That's the most in the country. In fact, 4 Indiana communities rank in the top 10 in the nation in the percentage of economy reliant on exports Elkhart, Kokomo, and Lafayette are 3, 4, and 5 on the list. So Mayor, I wanted to start with you. What does that mean? What does it mean that Columbus is on top of that list?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One is that there's a significant reward that comes with that, but there's a significant challenge. The reward is we have we often lead the state of Indiana in income, per capita income, and so because of that, we have the funds to address a lot of the issues that other communities cannot. You know, we're in the process of building a new entryway into town so that the entryway we have will not be harassed by the railroad. We have a heroin issue, you know, in Bartholomew County, not unlike other communities around here. But we have the funds that allow us to address that. And so we think we're going to be able to make some significant impacts, not only significant improvement with respect to the lives of the people in our community, but just the tangential costs associated with that. The challenge comes in that we have an international community. It requires us to address and respond to internationals. Now, I'll give you a few numbers. I mean, the city of Columbus is about 50,000 people. About 20% come from somewhere else. We have about 6,000 Latinos, 2,600 Indians, 2,000 Africans or African Americans. We've got about 600 Chinese, 300 Japanese, 150 French. The school corporation measures or tracks the number of languages spoken at home. The current number is 54. You know, and I understand we teach 80 languages here. If I had to come up with a list, I don't know that I could get much past 10. But the point is that we have to now develop a welcoming community in our city of Columbus. And again, we're in southern Indiana. You know, this is not an area that is known for tolerance or a welcoming attitude. And so it requires us to be purposeful about measuring, about talking to the people who have come here from other areas and asking them, you know, how are we doing? What can we do better? And be as specific as you can. And so we have developed several programs. One that we tried for a while we called Engage Columbus. And the whole notion was to go out to the HR departments for these various companies and find a way to bring them in, you know, to find a way to engage them. So it's great to be number one. You know, this is a very competitive country that we're in. It's great to be number one, but along with the rewards come some challenges, and trying to get the big tent, so to speak, you know, is a bit of a challenge.
Danny, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, what is it about Indiana's economy that makes us so export heavy, and how does that help us, or maybe in some cases hurt us?
Well, I mean, I think it's obviously our reliance on advanced manufacturing, you know, what we're doing in pharmaceuticals. I think we've got industries, agriculture, of course. We've got industries here that are very conducive to having an export-driven economy. So that none of that is obviously terribly surprising to anybody. The mayor did a nice job of outlining some of the challenges that presents for a state. And of course, I would just say that there are so many communities that are really around the state that are doing some incredible things, Columbus being one of them, Bloomington being another one. But if you talk to mayors and you think about the impacts that $38 billion worth of exports in your economy has for communities, I mean, the amount of philanthropy, it's not just jobs, it's philanthropy, it's community development. I mean, you don't have to look any further than Bloomington to know what kinds of impacts it can absolutely have. Mayor, you're absolutely right, and I think it's a great point, and it's one of the things that the governor has really focused on as somebody who is deeply interested in this topic and ensuring that Indiana is a globally competitive place. That's why he spends so much time on the road overseas and just pitching the Indiana story. And a big piece of that is how do we frame our communities to ensure that these are places that people want to come from all over the world to live.
So Indiana's biggest trading partners are Canada, Germany, Japan, and Mexico is number 2 in terms of being Indiana's largest export market. And that the relationship, though, can be pretty complicated. I mean, that's fantastic for the economy, but you'll remember that in the 2016 election, Indiana became a big focus of the presidential campaign after Carrier Corp announced that it was going to move jobs to Mexico. So Roberto, how do you characterize the relationship between Indiana and Mexico, and how that relationship is healthy or harmful.
Well, let me address two questions. First is the carrier aspect, which was at the time that Donald Trump was president-elect. He was not yet president of the United States, but this was at a time when there was a threat to withdraw from NAFTA and to build a wall and the very confrontational narrative that was being articulated at that time. The carrier example was a good example of something that seemed good that had unintended consequences later on. Because it is my understanding that carrier actually, because of keeping those jobs, first required tax credits. So you're basically taking away from the taxpayer in order to keep those jobs at home, or those jobs in Indiana. And at the same time, you have not yet measured what the outcome was in the entire productive chain following that. That always has a consequence in terms of either a higher price or less competitiveness. Part of the challenge, I think, is to build the type of reliable and credible safety net that can allow for that can enable us to address job displacement and job dislocation, given the tremendous amount of trade that exists. Mexico is not just the number 2 trading partner of Indiana. It's the number 2 trading partner of the entire United States. So Mexico buys more from the US than Japan, France, Britain, and Germany combined. So that's an immense amount of trade. In the border alone, the value of what goes back and forth on the border every single day is approximately $2.4 billion per day. That's an immense amount of a country that, when NAFTA started back in 1993 and 1994, was considered the size of Florida. And we were very worried about what economists like to call economic asymmetries. They like to use these big flashy terms, never mind that I'm an economist, but basically it meant that we were going to get squashed. And yet the greatest fear came from Ross Perot and the Great Sucking Sound that was supposed to, all the jobs fleeing south, and that has now been revived in the wake of the big NAFTA dispute. So the carrier set a bad precedent in terms of the relationship that you wanted as far as renegotiating what we now have as a new so-called NAFTA 2.0. In my opinion, it's 0.8, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. And the other aspect is, what image does this give to Indiana and the world? Well, at that time, it was the carrier example that set a bad precedent from our vantage point. But what Indiana has done, and the fact that perhaps we don't know, but you have very integrated supply chains with Mexico already. And you not only export to Mexico, Mexico not only, pardon me, you not only sell to Mexico, a lot of import. You're also buying a lot of stuff.
Absolutely.
You're buying avocado. I'm sure some fraternities here buy the tequila shots, and you're buying mangoes, and you're buying televisions, and you're buying auto parts, and that's part of what a productive chain and an integrated supply chain in all these sectors signifies. And so that said, I think it's very important to consider the importance of Indiana for Mexico and the importance of Mexico to Indiana. Somebody who's, sorry, I don't mean to extend over time, but one of the reasons that brings me here is that I've become a great fan of the great ambassadorial work that people like Michael McRobbie are doing in Mexico. And that's the type of integration that we need. We need more Mexicans here at IU to learn at the Kelley Business School. The Jacobs School has produced some phenomenal musicians in Mexico, and also at that other school, we also need Mexicans there and elsewhere. So education, human capital, capital market integration, talking about infrastructure, I think that's the way to go. And like Michael McRobbie, we need a whole host of others, and I can mention others later on that I know of. And that gives Indiana actually a very good name.
Mayor, I wondered if you could follow up on that a little bit. The carrier plant was actually in Indianapolis, but these are issues that local officials have to face all the time. Companies deciding to move jobs to another country and moving jobs in. How do you balance the positive and negative aspects of that?
It's really difficult because you can't do it without, how do I want to put this? As mayor, I get a lot of advice, okay? And it's very difficult to have that kind of conversation in a controlled or unemotional atmosphere. And his point is well taken that the unintended consequences are huge because you can't keep those jobs unless you feel like you've paid for them. And the folks who are doing the paying are somebody else. But the one point that I was struck by was your notice about the supply chain. There's a company in Columbus, Indiana that manufactures the brackets for seatbelt height adjusters. It's the little thing that goes up and down, on the side here. They ship the bracket to Ontario, where it is assembled into the actual seatbelt height adjuster itself, which is then shipped to Mexico for insertion into a Nissan or a Toyota or what have you. Yes. And so the whole point is that you may think that you're going to save jobs here. You just displaced them somewhere else. And it doesn't work for the long term. I mean, it really won't provide us with the highest and best use of the individuals or the economic capital that we're using.
Danny, obviously this was an issue that Governor Holcomb was dealing with really as he was coming into office. How do you all feel about how that whole situation turned out with carrier and similar situations?
I mean, I think the mayor makes a good point. These are always difficult things to grapple with. You've got many stakeholders that have many opinions. You've got people's livelihoods on the line. And so as a state, you try to do your assessment, your due diligence, and determine whether or not it's a solid investment and whether it's going to have long-term gains for the state. I can't speak to why that decision was made or how it came about, but I will say that the IEDC does I think, a phenomenal job of ensuring that every deal that is done and every investment that is made in companies that are relocating or growth companies here in which we're investing, that there's a hard determination of what the outcome will be and that it is performance-based. So we know that if growth isn't happening or the deliverables aren't there are clawbacks or there are funds that are never delivered. And the IEDC has a great track record of seeing
and the
those
IEDC
projects.
is the Indiana Economic Development Corporation?
The Indiana Economic Development Corporation has a phenomenal track record of seeing those projects through. But certainly, I mean, with any one of these deals, there are tons and tons of facets that go into them and many, many decisions that are made.
So I don't think we can get away from this topic without talking about tariffs. I mean, it's almost, the tariffs have been in the news for so long now, I actually had to sort of look up to see what the situation was at the moment. But I mean, Indiana is experiencing both sides of this issue. The protection, the U.S. protections on the steel industry help Indiana. Indiana is the nation's top steel producing state. At the same time, farmers and manufacturers, which are two enormous industries in Indiana, are hurt by the duties and retaliatory taxes on U.S. imports. Danny, does it feel like Indiana's stuck in the middle of this?
I mean, I think it's easy for a governor and an administration to get pulled into every single issue and every single discussion that's happening in Washington and all the debates. And I think Governor Holcomb has done an excellent job of keeping his eye on Indiana, ensuring that we're weighing in when it's appropriate, or he's weighing in when it's appropriate. I mean, I can think back to when the NAFTA discussions were going on, and when he huddled with our automakers here. Had many conversations with them, heard the concerns that were raised, not just sent a letter. I went with him. We actually went out to Washington, sat down with the vice president, sat down with the White House White House economic team, policy team, and talked through the issues with the automakers joining us and the suppliers joining us as well. So, I mean, I think he's done a nice job of picking his spots, and certainly where there's an opportunity to weigh in, he does.
So you got to give us a little bit of behind-the-scenes insight here. So. Obviously, Governor Holcomb's predecessor was Mike Pence, who is now the vice president. How much access do you guys get?
I bet about the same as everybody else.
Well, Mayor, I could ask you the same thing. The vice president is from your community there. Do you have an opportunity to talk to him about these issues?
It was a couple weekends ago. I waved to him as he was getting on his plane to go back to Washington. The truth of the matter is we have very little contact with Mike Pence. Now, I have a significant amount of contact with Greg Pence, and most of the conversations
who is a newly elected congressman.
Yeah, newly elected congressman from the Indiana 6th District, which includes Columbus. And most of the conversations I've had with him have centered around immigration. We thought initially that tariffs were going to be an issue, and I'll go back to the same example a moment ago about the seatbelt height adjuster. That we were concerned that their raw material prices were going to go up, and they're telling me no, that's really not that much of a problem. They found some exceptions in the law, and they're going to be able to make this work. But what they wanted to talk about, where they immediately shifted the conversation to, was labor, and the fact that they don't have enough labor, and that we have policies that make it difficult for them to attract labor, particularly from outside the country.
And Lesley, could I just,
Absolutely.
one thing I did want to note is that, and as Senator, I was state director for Senator Coates at one point, Dan Coates. I think we've got an incredible delegation. I think we've long had a history of sort of punching above our weight when it comes to representation that we have in Washington. So we do have considerable avenues, and now more than most times, I guess, Indiana is at the forefront and has people place it at levels of influence in Washington. But I think we've always had, or at least for a long, long time, people with credibility on the issues and also influence that have represented us in Washington. That makes a big difference too.
So, you mentioned tariffs. You thought that they were going to be a big issue. We're a year or a little or so into a lot of these issues. Has it turned out not to be the dramatic impact on Indiana's economy that we thought it might be?
At least from my perspective, yeah, in Columbus, we don't seem to hear that much about them. Again, the issue is labor and immigration.
Danny, thoughts about that? Do you?
It's what we hear all the time. Labor is the issue. I mean, there's not a conversation the governor has, whether we're talking about public health or transportation or child care or housing, that doesn't in some form or fashion come back around to what does our workforce look like, where are we finding individuals, and how are we hitting every piece of the pre-K through career pipeline to ensure that we're investing the resources the right way. And
I would say that we're particularly short, in my opinion, in the higher value add, the engineering degrees, those individuals with master's degrees in engineering, we have opportunities for them, but we can't get them here. We can't get them a green card, can't get them citizenship, can't get them a work visa. What used to take 6 months, say 15 years ago, now can take 10 years. And it's, in my opinion, unacceptable.
So we were I had down the list to talk about immigration, but we're just gonna jump to it. So, I'm shuffling my notes to find where I was going to talk about it. So this is really interesting. One of Bill Osterly, who's the founder of Angie's List and is a columnist at IBJ, has kind of a new obsession about looking at our population growth versus our economic growth, and looking at where Indiana is going to get its workers. Where are we going to have enough people to fill the jobs? The kind of things you're talking about now, and actually Indiana's growth is stagnating. And Bill wrote a column for IBJ recently where he argued that what growth Indiana has had has actually come from refugees and immigrants. Yet Indiana has not always made it as easy as some other places to settle in the state. I'm going to read a quote from his column. The global market for refugees right now is really good or really bad, if you happen to be one of them. Of the 65 million refugees last year, Indiana took in only 2,000. With 37 counties in Indiana losing population, why can't we be taking in 15,000 or 20,000? So Danny, should the state and its communities be working harder to bring in refugees, bring in immigrants, and try to address some of our labor and talent issues in that way?
I think it's a couple things. First of all, I think it certainly is a component. It's the governor's approach, at least, would dictate that it's an all of the above approach. I'll say a couple things, though, in terms of the growth of the population before I sort of pivot to that issue specifically. And Mayor, it is interesting. You're right on STEM issues and engineering. But I will say that since 2016, we've had an 8% jump in STEM bachelor's degrees. We've had a 4% jump in bachelor's degrees as a whole. We've seen our educational attainment rates jump 2.5 points, which doesn't seem like much, but it outstrips the national average. So I think as K-12 shifts, as the teaching profession evolves, and as schools like Indiana and Ivy Tech and Purdue move to different kinds of models where career exploration, navigation, and coaching and guidance evolves, we're only going to see those numbers go up. So we're pretty encouraged about that, but a lot of work to be done. I think when you look at the total growth for Indiana, the population growth, we had whatever it was, 32,000 roughly, I wrote down in my notes. In 2018, population increase, and we had 13,000 net new residents come into the state. No other state around us in the Midwest grew. They were all net losers when it came to growth. So something is positive there. That's a good trend. And really, when you look nationally, the trends are in the South and in the West. That's where you see a lot of the growth. There's a lot of states that are struggling with this particular issue. But the fact that we're seeing positive growth certainly is an encouraging thing. 207,000 new Hoosiers since 2010 is a positive thing for a state of 6.5 million people. I think one of the critical issues is actually the urbanization, right? It's the concentration of population, because the growth that's happening is really happening in central Indiana and a small handful of counties that are sort of centered around urban cores. And so then the governor thinks 100 million in broadband, 90 million in trails and bike trails. Those are, the Stellar program are things that are going to make outlying counties places that people want to live, and as you have better connectivity, you don't have to be in an urban core place. So that's why we're making the investments that we are. But I'd say that that's our biggest challenge in terms of immigration and the growth of refugee communities. I mean, I worked sort of in this when I led the Commission on Hispanic Affairs. The doubling of the community of the Hispanic community, just looking at that community from 2000 on, from about 200,000 to now over probably 450,000 and up to about 7% of the overall population. And so much, at one time it was a full third of that population under the age of 18. So when we were looking at school districts in Johnson County or Clark County, places where you wouldn't think, the infrastructure wasn't there, first of all, and you wouldn't think that type of growth, you'd see it, was happening. So those communities are changing. Of course, we know the Burmese community is changing. While we are a welcoming place, while we are identifying policies that might be barriers at the moment, and we're fighting some of those out in the legislative session right now, we also need to be ensuring that we are building that pipeline for our current students and our current workforce. You talked about carrier. What are we doing to catch those folks, get them retrained and back into the workforce? It's an all of the above approach.
Tiffany, and you work at an incredibly global company. How important is it that the community where your company is headquartered is global, is diverse, and reflects more of the larger company?
It's extremely important, right? We're in the innovation business, and so the best innovation comes from diverse perspectives, diverse minds. We were talking earlier about sort of the high talent pool. We're really focused on ensuring that we can get those folks here to Indiana, and those people sit in Indiana. So it's important to develop the pipeline, as Danny was saying, but also they sit anywhere around the globe, right? So for us, we really want to have those talents to come here so they can create the best medicines that can make the best impact on people's lives. That perception thing, I think, for Indiana is really important. We want to be perceived as a welcoming place. We are a welcoming place, and for us as a company, we have to ensure that people understand that this is a place where everybody can feel included and welcome. The governor's done a lot of good work to make sure that that's happening, but for us, to make sure people feel like this is a place where they can come and be accepted and do their best work is core to us getting the best out of our people.
Mayor, the immigration debate or other talent issues in Columbus could refugees, could immigration, could that be part of a solution in terms of bringing people in to solve Indiana's talent issues?
Well, I think so. The issue that we get into is when you want to talk about immigration, oftentimes the conversation just goes off the cliff and to the left because, you end up talking about illegal immigration and we can't focus our conversation on the legal part. And so I think, we've talked earlier in this conference about trying to have a dialogue, between opposing views, and that's sort of where, in my view, it breaks down first. What I'm trying to focus on is the legal immigration. And let's have a conversation about that. And yeah, to the extent that there are people from other countries who would like to just come over here and work, just pay taxes, raise a family, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Roberto, talk a little bit about the immigration issues. Obviously, the immigration debate with Mexico is at the center of really what we're talking about. How is what's going on at the border hurting or helping the Indiana and the nation's ability to attract better talent?
Oh, that's a very good question. The immigration debate, certainly, at least from our perspective, is one that has been captured by a lot of visceral feelings and and that jumping off the cliff and to the left that the mayor was sharing, and to the right and in the center and up and down and everywhere. But it gets very visceral. So you lose the opportunity. It gets very polarized, and you lose the opportunity of a constructive dialogue. And therefore, what some of my Chilean and Argentinian colleagues are now discussing, they have the same problems over there with the refugees from Venezuela or from Haiti, and the same type of debates about displacement and dislocation, and the need to construct an intelligent public policy that addresses the immigration influx that the states like Indiana need, or that the Texas needs, or California needs, or I know I'm much more familiar with the southern states, but that need to be able to sit down and construct a viable policy where it's not just the freeloading, or it's not just the illegal immigrant, and also get away from the narrative of thinking that trade wars and tariffs and walls are going to stop this. Over 80% of illegal immigrants, Mexican illegal immigrants and others, come in via plane, and they just overstay their welcome. That's the hard fact. That's not fake news. That's a hard fact. So how do you address that issue? Well, by perhaps constructing a series of incentives where it doesn't take 10 years to get a permit to work for somebody for a greenskeeper at a golf course, at some of the marvelous golf courses around here, for instance. That's a very popular job in opportunity in Mexico. Or for people who do the maintenance during the summer of the ski lifts. That's another one very popular. So those are jobs that are needed. They're needed elsewhere. They're needed in pharmaceuticals. Some of the great human capital that Mexico has and Central America and South America has developed recently. So I think there's a real intellectual and public policy challenge here of constructing a viable framework to address immigration issues that do not fall off the cliff, but actually are able to build gateways and pathways.
So I work for a business journal, so the truth is I could talk about the economic issues this whole time, but I don't want to do that. I want to, there are so many other ways that Indiana impacts the world, and the world impacts Indiana. Just here at IU, the IU Center for Global Health has serves more than 4.5 million Kenyans through a partnership. Lilly has the 30 by 30 program, which aims to create new access to quality healthcare for 30 million people in settings with limited resources every year by 2030. So Tiffany, I wanted to hear more about that. I mean, that's your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so what I do on a daily basis is I try to think about how to make Indiana better, and I try to think about how to make the world better using the special skills that Lilly has. So one of the things that Lesley was just talking about is our 30 by 30 initiative, which we announced in 2016. The goal is really to impact, improve healthcare systems, improve access for 30 million people by 2030 in resource-limited settings. We do a lot of work in places like Kenya, partnering with something called the AMPATH Consortium, of which IU is a part of, to help improve healthcare there. I've been there, and it's amazing to see how people who are from IU or from Lilly or from all of these other Indiana-based places are going other places and truly making a difference, providing healthcare services, but building hospitals where they did not exist anymore. We do a lot here in Indiana as well to make our community better, and we've used the resources we have here to do that. But there is so much power in the brains and the energy and the resources and the economic resources in this state that we export that along with products. And it's really powerful to see the many different ways that Indiana is exporting all of its many different skills, and I get to see it every day, and I'm really lucky for that.
So it's easy to think about those programs as helping the people who are in other places, and of course they do, and that's extremely important. How do you think it helps the IU students or even folks at Lilly who participate in that? What do they bring back with them that helps us here in Indiana?
Sure, so the first thing is agility. Right, so what we need from our workforce base, and I think you can hear it no matter what the job is the ability to adapt. The environment is changing for all of our businesses, for all of the people who live and work in this state, And so learning to operate in an environment that is completely different than your own teaches you a skill that you can take back and use with your team, use in your classroom, use with your family. It gives you those skills to learn and adapt. What I think is also important is a different cultural awareness, right? So those diverse perspectives give you the ability to see things differently, maybe come up with ideas you hadn't, look at the world differently, look at problems differently, and come up with new and novel solutions. And so our ability to give our employees the opportunity to go to these places, think differently, bring those things back, build connections is really important. In particular for us, because what we do is we do things for patients, right? The products that we make go into people's bodies. We have to make sure that we connect whatever we do in our innovation story to the mission of serving patients. And so it's really important for our people to see we're making a difference in people's lives.
So we're not just lucky in Indiana to have Lilly. We have a number of global companies, Cummins, Rolls-Royce, Cook Group, all of these companies that are doing business across the world. Danny, how do you think that's helpful to Indiana to have those experts that are maybe working abroad for a while, coming back, but then also having the kinds of companies that can attract the brightest minds back to Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tiffany hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's a change of perspective. It's an exposure to different cultures and the ability to adapt in a global economy. I think that's the reality. We're getting to the we are at a point probably. I mean, I suppose we are where it is binary economically and from the workforce standpoint. You're either going in the right direction or you're not. And I think the world is becoming more and more global and connected. We've been talking about that for 40 minutes already, and that's just the reality. And as somebody who grew up, my wife and I have only been in Indiana for 10 years, born and raised in Miami, so I grew up in a place that is very much, obviously, multicultural, and the benefits to that are huge. And I mean, it was funny because just last night it was. My wife and I were watching TV, and she was on the computer looking at different things, and I guess an article popped up. We're up in Hamilton County. An article popped up that showed the National Merit Scholars from Carmel High School, and probably 2/3 of them were Asian or Indian, a healthy mix of men and women, boys and girls. I mean, so it is changing in a lot of places in Indiana. I was blown away by that. It was a wonderful thing, but I was blown away by that. I think the benefits are huge for the state.
So I do want to talk a little. We've talked a lot about exporting, whether it's good works, exporting goods. I do want to talk about direct foreign investment in Indiana. Indiana is home to more than 900 foreign-owned companies that employ almost 200,000 Hoosiers. The state is home to the highest percentage of private sector jobs coming from foreign-owned firms in the Midwest. And Governor Holcomb has led 8 foreign trade missions since he became governor 2 years ago. Danny, why is there so much emphasis in that area?
I mean, there's 82 of our 92 counties have some company that is foreign direct investment in their county, 82 of 92. You mentioned the numbers, 950 companies. What's interesting is that so many of the companies that actually do the exporting, I think it's like 85% of the companies that do the exporting in the state of Indiana are actually sub 500 employees, so it's a healthy mix. The investment is huge. It's billions of dollars. We talked about the impacts already, and we've, in Indiana, for a long time, made important investments in developing a regulatory climate, a tax climate that's healthy. We make investments in our education system. We have world-class universities. I mean, all of the components are there, and when the governor looks at it, he says, we're ripe for this. And so he does spend quite a bit of time overseas.
More than most governors in my memory.
That is true, but we can point to specific things. I mean, so emphasis is one. Emphasis was going to make an investment in Indiana, but the governor spent time with them in India. Now they've got their essentially their global training education, or the U.S. training headquarters in Indianapolis, which is a big deal. But there's other, I mean, Filtrek. So he was in Italy in 2018, and we had a company, a manufacturer of filter systems that is now in Daleville in Delaware County, that is now their U.S. headquarters.
Which is funny, you don't think of a place like Daleville as the U.S. headquarters for a global company.
Right, and you talk about, there's a county, Delaware County, and now you have this infusion of an international company that's now made that their U.S. headquarters, and Saturn Pet Foods that has Henry Holcomb, the star of the show, always.
Henry Holcomb is the dog.
Is the
if
schnauzer.
you can follow Henry on Twitter.
It is
right?
fun, yeah, and it is a pretty funny account, actually.
Yeah.
But Henry's a star. We can talk. It's Henry and Jobs. I think those are the two things. But Saturn Pet Foods that came over from Germany, and that was a direct correlation to the governor's travel to Germany and the IEDC's travel. Jim Schellinger, his travel to Germany, and just the ability to be on the ground developing those types of relationships do pay off in the long run. And that's thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of investment that otherwise our state would not see.
Roberto, you've talked a lot about the importance of the relationships here. Are these trade missions important? Do they matter?
Oh, they absolutely matter on both sides. And I think they matter on also between states, as they do between states and Mexico. One of the grave challenges that Mexico faces today is that since the era of integration with the global world, and it's something that, this is just a political comment of mine now, but it's something that I think the new administration of Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador has failed to understand, that this is not Venezuela with high oil prices or Argentina with high soy prices. This is an incredibly diversified economy that is deeply integrated with the rest of the world. And unfortunately, one of the great challenges that we face is that has developed a sense of the two Mexicos. The Mexicos that are readily adaptable and agile and are able to identify with Eli Lilly or with the many companies here, or that are able to produce a one-star restaurant a one Michelin star restaurant in Chicago, or our world famous neurosurgeons in Los Angeles, or those that win all the Oscars for Best Director. Or Mexicans that today, because of the expansion of auto parts, now have plants operating in Flint, Michigan. Racine is a prominent example of this, and how. So those are a product of trade missions, and it's not just hooray, hooray, and this is what we're going to do. It's actually building bridges and building pathways and gateways, and again, not just because I'm an IU and I had the opportunity to host Lori and Michael McRobbie. I see Lori back there, and when they came down, because of the visit, and the dean of UNAM, the largest university in all of Latin America, one of the most important educational institutions abroad, was here in these past 2 days. To me, it was glorious to come into IU and see the Mexican flag here. Now that makes a difference that really makes a difference, not just in terms of the education, but in this sense, if you begin to talk about a direct flight from Indianapolis to Mexico City, you know, that's not just the narrative, the nice narrative of building bridges. That's actually generating value added. That's generating job opportunities in Indiana. It's generating job opportunities in Mexico. And that's as a result of a very normal human practice, which is the freedom to trade, voluntarily trade goods and services.
Go ahead, please.
Well, Lesley, if I could add just, the economic side of this, I think, is pretty easy to understand. But I would add there's a personal side. And this, I don't want to take too long, but my father, graduated from high school in 1940. And so you can imagine what he was doing in the early part of the 1940s. He was in the U.S. Navy, and he was bobbing around, somewhere in the South Pacific. In the 1980s, he was 60 years old. He wanted to buy a pickup truck. And so we went out and we looked at the Ford and we looked at the Chevy. And I said, Dad, let's go over here and take a look at the Toyota. He said, no, I'm not interested. I said, well, Consumer Reports, and it's a good product, and you'll like it. He said, no, thank you. And I'm a little slow sometimes, so I went, after the third time, he explained it in words I could understand that was not going to happen. And my point is that today, my kids, so we're one generation in between, my kids have none of that animus. It's gone, okay? And how did that happen? I think trade had a lot to do with it. I think those 300 Japanese who live in Columbus had a lot to do with that. And the investment that those Japanese companies have made have a lot to do with that. And so it's not just the money, right? It's how we get along with each other. So I fully support it. I think it's a great thing for us to have.
Can I do a footnote?
Yeah,
follow-up comment?
absolutely.
We have a famous saying in Latin America, hablando se entiende la gente, which means basically that if we talk to each other, we will be able to understand each other. My mother used to tell me that all the time, but that's another story. And trade is exactly that. It's an exchange of not just of goods, but of ideas. And it's this dialogue that, at least in Mexico, one of the incredible transformations. You can be Leninist, Maoist, super left wing or super right wing or whatever. We're all in favor of greater trade.
And let's not forget that when the governor goes on these missions, we have multinational companies right here who have a presence in those places. And so while it's talking about the foreign investments here in Indiana, the governor does a great job of making sure that he's talking about the innovation story here in Indiana and those other countries, which matters to companies that are based right here in Indiana. Right? So it builds us as well.
That is a great point. I mean, he was just in Germany a couple of weeks ago and visiting with companies that are headquartered right here in Indiana. And so to see how those operations are functioning overseas, and then to bring some of those best practices back and apply it to our own workforce. But I mean, I would just stress, and you would expect nothing less from me. I'm sort of the evangelist for the administration. I think we're doing the best job in the world. So, I would say when the governor talks about his next level agenda, I think the significance of that is, and Lesley, you mentioned he's traveled some more than his two predecessors for sure. We have over a couple of decades laid some significant groundwork in the state of Indiana, and our ability to make investments in developing those relationships and attracting those companies and those types of investments, paired with the significant investments we've made in our infrastructure, in our schools, in our universities, in quality of life initiatives around the state, is really where you start to see the game changer, right? So for him, it really is a next level agenda, because he's looking at this going, okay, so here, if I'm lining up all the investments we've made over time, now it's time to go out and sell these companies on the wonderful place that Indiana is to come.
So we're going to take questions. So if you've got questions, get ready. Give me 1 second. Actually, no, let's go ahead. I'll wait till the end. Please go right ahead. You in the vest there. Yeah. Oh, is there a mic?
We were captivating.
That's right.
We kept you from doing your job.
So there was a lot of mention of the interconnectedness of this state, but Indiana and the Midwest generally gets talked about a lot as if people here have no knowledge of anything that happens in the rest of the world, and it feels isolated. Growing up here, I was lucky enough to read about it and learn about it in school, but that's largely something that doesn't happen a lot. What are some ways, both through the government, through policy, and corporate decisions, that the interconnectedness that does exist in the state, the awareness of that actually is known for the people who live here, rather than just something that happens without public knowledge?
Anybody want to jump in? Danny, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it happens more than you think. I mean, it's a fair point. It happens more than you think, and I think part of it is evangelizing through the landscape in Indiana continues to change. I've referenced some of the educational attainment rates and other things. Indiana continues to evolve as a state. We've had great leadership. We've had wonderful leadership in Washington. I think it's incumbent upon us as government and institutions like IU to continue to evangelize to the people that live here the significance of these types of investments. We were talking earlier about, and I forget with whom we were just speaking, but we were talking earlier, there's just not always a recognition of the value, even these trade missions, amazingly, despite the fact that we can demonstrate significant return. So I think it's just a question of ensuring that we're telling the story. But I also think, and the mayor made a good point, that is going to evolve over time as generations pass, because as we are more and more global and interconnected, I think folks are just going to infuse that. You look at what I referenced before, what's happening in Hamilton County and really all over the state.
I think we've seen time and time again that Hoosiers are not that great at telling their own story. I think people in the Midwest, and I think Indiana, tend to be a little bit modest and are not really that great at going out and blowing our own horns. Tiffany, we were talking about the fact that you came here from another place. Were you surprised when you got here at everything that was going on?
Well, so I'm originally from here, but I spent 10 years away in D.C. And I will say, maybe this makes me sound old, so sorry about that. But to see the evolution of where Indiana is at from where it was when I was a kid, I think I hear you on the interconnectedness. It's something we have to work together on, not just in Indiana, but frankly in the world throughout. But we are so far away from where they were when I was a kid being raised in Indiana. It's impressive to see. I would also say the other thing is I think when people come here, they get it, right? So when you come here, you connect to this place. I think about the fact that Indianapolis hosts so many sporting events and so many conferences, and it brings people from all over the world here, and frankly, it lets people from Indiana interact with people all over the world. Think about the Super Bowl way back when. That brand really helps connect us to the rest of the world. So we have to continue to tell our story about how we are, the people who we are, which is hard for us because we are Hoosiers, and there is some quiet modesty in that. But the story is in there. We just have to keep talking about it.
Who else had a question? And I think you had your hand up first. Microphone is coming your way.
Hello, my name is Tori Collins. I'm an international studies master's student. I research Mexican politics and water issues. And so I know about the new administration that was recently elected, President Lopez Obrador, and his party Morena, and they're more left-leaning than say the previous administration, which obviously is kind of contentious with our more conservative political atmosphere, both here in Indiana and in the US in general, with the Trump administration. So I was wondering what kind of issues is that causing, if any, and how is that impacting her, or how might it impact trade relations between Indiana and Mexico? Thank you.
I guess that question's for me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. Jared Kushner was just in Mexico for a private meeting with President Lopez Obrador. He, by the way, has been a great ambassador. A lot of the hurtful narrative has been significantly, the damage control is done by him, and he's done a fantastic job doing it, and has assembled many of the governors especially from the southern states, to come and talk on behalf of the need for greater integration and greater economic and cultural relationship with Mexico, also about sharing technologies and policy initiatives that can address some of the entrenched problems with that vicious cycle of corruption, crime, violence, and impunity that particularly characterized the last administration. The vote on July 1st of last year was not a vote of left versus right. It was a ferocious vote because it was truly a mandate. It was unbelievable the way that Lopez Obrador won. A watershed moment in Mexican modern history. He won with a supermajority, but not because he was promising an agenda that seems to be economically suspect or whatever you might say. It was a punishment for the type of corruption and impunity that prevailed in the previous administration. That said, I think that the electric shock is going to come from the failure of Lopez Obrador's administration to understand Mexico's place in the world, and the fact that it's deeply integrated with not just the United States and Canada. It sells an enormous amount to Canada as well, but also on all sides of its border. Mexico has over 47 free trade agreements, not just NAFTA. It's 47 free trade agreements, each with their own governance and their own rules. And failure to understand that, for instance, they now want to go back. The current Minister of Electricity wants to go back on the opening of the electricity reform. And there's talk also about canceling all private investment in deep sea water drilling. That's going to occasion a flood of class action suits in New York. And the price that they're going to pay, I don't think they've realized what they're getting their hands into. One of the great benefits of a trade agreement for less developed nations is that you import the quality of the institutional quality of reliable investment regimes. When you have the vision of somebody talking about agility and adaptability and flexibility, or trade missions, or the challenges that are being faced together with the rewards that are being gained, when you're talking about all of that, and you become a partner in that, you begin to import that, and that is what is developed into the phenomenon I was mentioning before, the two Mexicos. The Mexico that is furiously competitive, all about cost reduction, that is cutting edge, that believes in investing in technology, all those great stories, versus that Mexico that is disenfranchised, that is extremely bureaucratic, that is, forget third world, I think we could call it probably fifth world. And our greatest challenge is how do we bring those two together? By the way, the migration problem in Mexico is not those leaving. There's actually, for every one Mexican that leaves the United States, 3 come back. It's between the zones that there's an enormous amount of mobility, and it leaves those disenfranchised zones without human capital. So I think it's not so much the narrative and the posture of the left versus the Trump administration. Actually, they like each other. You know, what does he call him? Juan Trump, right? And they talk on the phone and whatnot, and there seems to be a good relationship there. Mexico's taking it for granted that the new NAFTA is going to get approved. That's a hugely mistaken assumption, given the challenges facing the House and senatorial approval. Well, I won't talk about that, but I think it's a mistaken assumption on the part of the AMLO administration. More so, I think, if they don't revise their premises, if they don't check their premises, reality is going to come back to bite them.
Right back here, yep.
Hello. Hi, thanks. My name's Tyler Smith. If there's any theme you could say for this conference that we've seen through the past 2 days, is that the world is changing and it's only changing faster. So whether our economy changes through immigration or trade or more likely just through simple innovation, Hoosier workers are going to be displaced and their work or their jobs are going to change. So what is our state doing on a local level and on a state level to make sure that the Hoosier workers who may not have the benefit of a dynamic education like we give here have a safety net and have some way to adapt to the new environment?
So, is that for me?
Yeah. Well, we'll come to you too, Mayor.
Okay. So that's a good question. So we obviously have spent, since the beginning of the administration, the governor has said this is going to be the issue that defines my administration, and we're going to, he wants to be the workforce governor, and we're focused on this. And he's received, we've made some significant investments that he's received credit for, and I think he's got credibility on the issue. So what we have tried to do is look at this issue as truly as a pipeline, right? And then identify where the handoffs are happening and where they're not happening. And then what kinds of investments are we making to ensure that along every step of that path, there are resources in place that move somebody from one step to the next. And so when we think about, as an example, something like a computer science mandate in every classroom. So going back to last session, right, ensuring that every single one of our schools is embedding computer science and STEM courses into their curriculum in the elementary and middle school spaces. When we think about workforce ready grants as part of the governor's Next Level Jobs initiative, so we have now said we're going to spend upwards of $300 million a year on 21st century scholarships to send predominantly low-income first-generation students to down traditional 4-year academic tracks, college and university tracks in the state of Indiana. But what we're also doing is for those 25,000 kids every year that get to the end of graduation, actually graduate, get their high school diplomas, and have no post-secondary plans at all, no training and no education plans, how do we grab those kids through with a workforce ready grant and say, in these key sectors, whether that's healthcare, IT, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, logistics, how do we capture these kids? We'll send you to Ivy Tech or Vincennes. We're actually going to expand the eligibility this year, but send you down that track, a technical certificate track that gets you in less than 2 years, gets you the 18 credit hours or whatever that you need to get that tech certificate and out into the workforce for free of cost. It's a last dollar program. So we've had about 14,000 new enrollments this year, and you look at a place like Ivy Tech that has seen a sharp decline in enrollments over the last 5 years. 11% jump in workforce ready eligible programs this year, and it's because we've invested in that spot. But then we also recognize that the fact of the matter is that, and you mentioned the nature of change and the rapidity with which it's happening, so much of that is happening on the job, right? In our economy, labor participation is down all across the country, but still, we've now outpaced national labor participation for 56 consecutive months. So people here are working. We've got a low unemployment rate. Our underemployment rate, as best as we can measure that, or as best as the feds measure that, is above the national average. So we've got to be making investments in companies that are investing in their people. And so the governor created the employer training grant. It essentially offsets costs for employers to train. And the interesting thing about that is a full 60% of the companies that participate in that program, which is 450 companies now, are actually sub 50 employees or so. So it's targeted at small businesses that don't necessarily have the capital to invest a whole lot in training their people. And then just a renewed emphasis on apprenticeships. So we have one of the few tech, computer science, federally registered apprenticeship programs in the state of Indiana that's feeding our tech ecosystem that we're building, not just in central Indiana, but in the Northeast. And we're pumping dollars into operations that are taking on apprenticeships. And then we're trying, the last thing I would say is we're trying very hard to drop down the post-secondary attainment component into the secondary space. So how do we look at our high schools and say, not just random acts of dual credit or not just random acts of career and technical education, but how do we do it with a purpose? How do we ensure that the pathways stack? We've got graduation pathways now in the state of Indiana, which means that we've gone from a test being, a 10th grade test essentially dictating whether I go into remediation or stay on my path and eventually get to a graduation that means something, to now saying, you're going to strive, every child, every high school student in the state of Indiana is going to strive towards that diploma, but they're also going to demonstrate employability, so that's going to be work or project-based learning, and they're also going to demonstrate post-secondary readiness, so that's a baseline score on the SAT or ACT, that's an industry-recognized certification, that's an ASVAB, the military test, so now we've created this ability for students to kind of pick and choose from those buckets and craft a pathway that they want that leads them into something post-secondary. And to the degree that we can be delivering that post-secondary experience while we're paying for the secondary experience, not only are we going to keep costs down, but it's a more effective way to eat into that leaky pipeline and turn off the spigot that we know. Because if we've got 80,000 people that age out of our workforce every single year. 80,000 reach retirement age. Now, people aren't retiring at 65 anymore, but 80,000 every single year, and that's not expected to change for the next decade. And so if we're only filling up that bucket with kids that are coming out of high school and then not continuing on, it is so much more expensive to catch them on the back end and try to retrain them than it is to get them something of value beyond a high school diploma while they're sitting in that seat in high school.
And to add to what Danny was saying, we're also, as a state, I think, thinking about starting earlier, right? So this pre-K initiative is really important because we're getting kids focused on education so that they're not behind by the time they get to school. So you have to start all the way down the pipeline. You talk about that college level, you talk about the high school level, but you also talk about 3- and 4-year-olds. And if you haven't been in a classroom until you're 7, then you're already behind. And if the world is changing and we're waiting until then to get to you, you're so far behind, it's really hard for you to catch up.
Mayor, this is a local issue too. I mean, it's not just at the state level.
It really is. We have in Columbus what we call the Columbus Education Coalition, and what it is an opportunity for manufacturers, for the employers to talk to the educators. We actually get them together in the same room, and basically what we're saying is we're making a product over here. These graduates from our high school or technical schools, what have you, is that product meeting your needs? And what we learned, starting about 6-7 years ago was, well, not really. And so what we've been able to do is to identify programs that are specifically targeted to the kind of skills that these manufacturers want. And then we also have in Columbus opportunities for, I wouldn't call it post-secondary, but maybe that's what it is, but an opportunity to get an associate's degree or a certificate in welding, some kind of a technical achievement that will actually help them do their work. And I'll tell you too, one of the things that I try to do as mayor when given the opportunity is to use the pulpit. Just to explain to people the importance of education and the fact that what you thought was good enough for you, the opportunity just to graduate from high school and go to work, that's not good enough for your kids. So don't you be satisfied with that and don't let them.
And one other thing just to add is I think all of the leaders in the state get this, right? So Indiana just has a really good history of having strong public-private university partnerships. And so all of the people who are focused on these issues hit all parts of the sector. So you're talking to manufacturers and government at the state and the local level. Companies like us care as well. So everybody is focused on it.
The key, Tyler, is that, the reality is that the model, we've had a model for a long time, which is first you learn and then you earn. And the truth is that it has to change. It is changing. It's changed already. and it's evolving. The kids are learning through experiential learning while they're still in school, and those experiences have to prepare them for something post-secondary. And this governor is never going to tell kids, well, you shouldn't go down a traditional 4-year track or get a bachelor's degree. We want kids aspiring to whatever they can attain, but it's okay if you get there at a bachelor's degree when you're 30. If you pick up some tech certificates along the way and you've got a ton of work experience, it's going to make you a more in-demand employee. And that's where we really do see the model evolving quite a bit.
You had a question right here.
Hi, my name is Summer Snyder. I'm a freshman at IU, and my question is in regards to tariffs. So perhaps certain companies have not been greatly affected by the steel tariffs. However, I can't help but observe that the shift away from free market conservatism towards trade protectionism in the Republican Party, along with the ongoing US-China trade war under the Trump administration, has had a detrimental effect on Indiana's economy, especially on the automobile industry. And I've also observed that the US-China trade war is reminiscent of US-Japan trade war in the 80s. So my question is ultimately, did we not learn our lesson from the negative economic effects that came about from the US-Japan trade war of the 80s?
Who wants to jump on that one?
I'll jump on that.
Go for it.
A freshman?
I know, right? I'm pretty impressed.
Well, what a fantastic question. Tariffs are a distortion on prices. Prices are the language between suppliers, between supply and demand, that basically we use in order to be able to assign resources, or at least that's what the economists teach us. But free and voluntary trade cannot occur with a tariff. Why is a tariff 10%? Why not 9.8 or 11.3 or my favorite number, 17.7? I mean, it's completely arbitrary, and it sends the wrong signal. The very notion of a trade war is a contradiction in terms. If you think of the basis of trade, trade happens, one benefits only if the other party benefits. You exchange goods and services freely and voluntarily. Both parties necessarily have to benefit. That's the heart of what is called comparative advantage. So to talk about a trade war is like, when you impose a tariff, it's like you're hitting yourself, because the one you're hurting is the U.S. consumer. So a tariff, let's say on pharmaceuticals or on medicines, right? So what you're doing is you're hitting yourself because you're hurting the consumer. And so retaliatory tariffs are also contradictory, because it's, oh, you're going to hit yourself? Then you know what? I'm going to hit myself too. And it just, and that completely distorts the very idea of exchange. Now that said, there's a lot more talk to the walk. I mean, NAFTA may have been the worst trade deal in history from the Trump administration's point of view, but what he put in its place is just a little bit different. So there was a politically very calculated strategy in my personal view, and thank goodness that prevailed, and I hope it does get approved. In the process, he was able to liberalize the dairy market and to modernize very much needed updates in digital commerce. But I'd love to hear some other reasons.
Was it Mark Twain or Will Rogers said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes?
It rhymes. Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yeah, you know. And what I would tell you is that we can both study the same thing, and somebody will learn this portion of it, forget the rest, and I'll do the opposite. But yeah, the one thing that I do remember from my freshman year was that for an economics 101 or 102 is that the price goes up, you sell less. I mean, and I think it's pretty simplistic, and why we think that we're going to be able to manage that to our benefit is hard for me to see. As I said before, our experience with trade has been nothing but good, and so I would encourage everybody else to try to make it as easy as possible.
Yep. Wait, you're right there.
Hi, I'm Antonia Fappel, and I'm a junior studying political science and English. And throughout the conference, several times it's come up that climate change is an impacting not only the world, but the United States. And I couldn't help but notice that hasn't really come up as a subject, and it's a pretty commonly agreed point of view that the Midwest and Indiana being a part of that lags behind in climate change initiatives. Where do you think Indiana is heading as far as joining the rest of the nation and the rest of the world in getting on board behind making proactive climate change decisions and how that will impact local communities and local economies?
I mean, I'd be speaking out of school if I attempted to, I wouldn't know nearly where to begin if I attempted to answer that question on behalf of the administration.
You know, we get a lot, I don't know how to answer it either, to be honest. I mean, we get a lot of, we are often encouraged to pursue green alternatives, you know, with the city. For example, we've got a wastewater treatment plant, you know, and is there a way that we can try to find electrification or solar generation, you know, for that? And what I'll tell you is that every time we look at those from a municipality's perspective, it's difficult to make to pencil the numbers out. You know, just difficult to make it work. You have to have a significant, and this is where it gets difficult, a significant political base that will volunteer to say, go ahead and spend the money. You know, that it's to our benefit. And that is the part that's difficult to find. You know, so until that changes, I don't know that we'll get a better answer, to be candid.
Roberto?
Just a very quick footnote. An engineer from the other school was able to assemble a group of intellectuals throughout, a group of engineers and geologists and specialists throughout the nation to propose that instead of a wall, you build a corridor of solar panels and aeolic industry. Sonora and Chihuahua are some of the most privileged regions in the world for solar energy. And to free up capital, instead of the NAFTA bank, which is Bush 43 calls it the nada bank, because it doesn't do anything, it does nothing. Well, perhaps it could start channeling capital towards that. So at least from that perspective, we were very impressed. We were very impressed with this idea. We love this idea, and so at least one person or a few other people are thinking about green alternatives, clean alternatives that I believe would be in principle consistent with climate change.
So we've got like 2.5 minutes. We probably have time for one more question. I see one right here. You got us started, so you can take us home.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I was wondering what you are planning on doing to create the political will within the state of Indiana to act on climate change, because the effects of that are going to really severely affect the economy here, particularly with agriculture. When we get increased flooding, which is what is projected for this state, that is going to really harshly affect those Hoosiers that do depend on agriculture to make their living, and for those of us around America who rely on the food that is grown here. And then also, it's also a huge health issue, as the instances of Lyme disease will be increasing as well. That has already been recorded. And then also with insects such as mosquitoes, their vectors for malaria are coming up as the regions in which they live are growing. And I also think that's a huge reason for a lot of students, such as the students in the International Studies Department, for example, why we are not staying in Indiana for these jobs, because they're not jobs that really reflect what we study or what we're interested in. So I think I would really encourage for there to be a lot of initiatives to create political will to act on this and to have jobs working directly for it, because that's what this generation is really looking to do work in, and it's important to the future of our economy in this state.
That sounded as much like a challenge for all of us to take with us, I think, than a question. And we are going to wrap up, so I apologize. But
There's 58 seconds left.
57.
I think we may not have the experts. I think we may not have the right group to answer it, but I do think it's a great question. And
Leslie?
I can
oh,
see
Mayor,
being,
oh yeah,
well,
please.
I can see being able to do that on a small, discrete project. You know, I talked about a wastewater treatment plant. I mean, that's probably something that we can make happen, because it's small enough that those people who would be dead set against it are in the minority, or the small minority. But to do it in a large way, where you, say if you wanted to get rid of coal burning fossil fuel type electrification plants. Boy, I mean, that's just going to be a real challenge. And so I don't have a good answer for you in terms of how you develop that political will.
I'm going to jump in just as an observer of Indiana government and politics. What you've got in Indiana is a really difficult balancing act that's always going on. The reason that it's cheaper to live here and the reason that businesses like to do business here because there's less regulation are the same reasons why it's more difficult for government to take on a lot of these big issues. You can't, as the mayor said, it's a lot more expensive to create the wastewater treatment plant or to develop the alternative energy sources. And in a lot of places, that's okay. And in Indiana, there's a little bit different mindset about taxpayer money and spending money. So it's not that. I think I can guess that it's important to everybody up here, but it is a very different balancing act here than it may be in other places. So I'm going to jump in and say that on behalf of some of the panelists, I think. So listen, I'm so impressed with all the questions. It's intimidating to be up here trying to moderate when the people in the audience and the people on the panel are all smarter than you are. So thank you very much for all your patience, and thanks to our panelists.
Mayor, it's a pleasure.